This episode of the Quantum Space Innovating Trust podcast is brought to you in association with Vibu Systems, pioneers in software protection, licensing, and long-term digital trust. Quantum computing is no longer theoretical, and it poses a fundamental challenge to today's cryptography. Methods like RSA and ECC will not survive the quantum era. With its next code meter generation, Vibu Systems is already preparing a smooth, compatible transition to post-quantum ready security across hardware, software, and cloud licensing. Discover how CodeMeter is being engineered for the post-quantum future and why preparing early is the only safe strategy. Visit vibu.com/PQC today.
Welcome back to Innovating Trust. Last week, Anna and I spent some time looking at Europe's digital regulatory landscape and making the argument that when you stop treating those frameworks individually and start reading them structurally, something unexpected appears. They stop looking like separate policy initiatives and start behaving like parts of a single operating system. Identity defining participation, cryptography anchoring time, security assigning responsibility, automation executing decisions, and interoperability allowing institutions to rely on each other without rebuilding trust from scratch every time. If you haven't heard that episode yet, I would recommend going back to it, not because you need it to follow today's conversation, but because the arguments we built there create a useful backdrop for where I want to go today. Because there was a moment in that episode, and if you listen carefully, you might have caught it, where Anna made a pointed observation about the licensing industry as a whole. The question she was really asking was whether licensing vendors would recognize the structural shift happening around them and reposition themselves as institutional permission control infrastructure, or whether the industry would stay anchored to legacy models and hope the world didn't change fast enough to make that a problem. It was a sharper version of a question the industry, we feel, has been quietly avoiding, and it wasn't rhetorical. Because what I want to do today is to make the case that licensing isn't just one of the things that needs to adapt to this new environment. It's the operational enforcement mechanism that the ownership layer of the trust stack has been missing. The piece that transforms commercial authorization from a document into a runtime condition, and the one that, if you understand it properly, changes how you think about everything from software delivery to regulatory compliance to the commercial models that sit underneath both. This week on the Quantum Space, we published 3 pieces that build this argument from the ground up. And I'm going to work through the core of that argument today, and I'm going to do it in a way that makes sense whether you've read those articles or not. Because some of you have, and some of you are probably listening to this on a Thursday morning commute having seen none of it. Both of those are fine. The argument stands on its own. So let's start at the beginning.
Section 1. What we mean when we talk about trust.
For most of its history, the software industry has described digital trust in 3 layers. It's a model that became so widely accepted it almost stopped being a model. It just became the way people thought about the problem. The first is identity. Identity answers a fundamental question. Who is acting? Before a system grants access, before a transaction proceeds, before a device communicates with another device, Identity establishes that the participant is who they claim to be. It governs entry. It is the gate. The second is cryptography. Cryptography answers a different question. It's what's present, authentic, and intact. It protects data as it moves between systems. It validates that code hasn't been tampered with. It provides the mathematical guarantee that what you received is what was sent and that no one has interfered with it in transit. Cryptography governs integrity. The third is security. Security answers, can this system withstand pressure? It covers resilience, the ability to detect interference, respond to it, recover from it, and keep operating as intended even when someone is actively trying to make it do otherwise. Security governs resilience. 3 layers, 3 distinct questions, and for a long time, a surprisingly long time, these 3 appear to be sufficient. At the quantum space, we've argued for a richer model, one that maps the full regulatory and operational architecture of digital trust across 5 layers. But even if you don't accept, or even if you do accept the broader framework, the conventional 3-layer view has a gap in it that doesn't disappear just by expanding the model. It has to be directly addressed. And to understand why, you need to understand what makes 3 layers feel like enough in the first place. The reason 3 layers felt like enough is important to understand because it explains exactly why they no longer are, and why the gap this creates sits specifically inside the ownership layer of a complete trust architecture. Software used to be static. You licensed a product, it was installed, it ran within fixed boundaries for the duration of its operational life. The commercial terms agreed at the point of purchase reflected the operational reality throughout. What the system was technically capable of doing and what it was commercially authorized to do were aligned because both were established at the same moment and neither changed. Identity told you who was using it. Cryptography told you the code was intact. Security protected it against attack. And since the software itself didn't evolve after deployment, there was no meaningful gaps left unaddressed. That world is gone. Not gradually, not in specific sectors, comprehensively gone. Modern software doesn't stay the same after it's deployed. Features are activated remotely. Capabilities can vary by geography. Access depends on subscription status, usage volume, service tier, or regulatory context. The version running in a facility in Germany may behave differently from the version running on the same hardware in Singapore. Not because someone modified it locally, but because the entitlement layer governs what is allowed to do in each context. And this is before we get to industrial environments where a single deployed platform might support modular capability tiers or temporary feature activation, predictive maintenance modules, safety-critical operational limits, and regional-specific configurations, all of which can change independently of each other over a product life cycle that might span, say, 15 years. In that environment, the conventional 3-layer model has a serious problem because none of those 3 layers, not identity, not cryptography, not security, can answer the question that matters most in a dynamic, continuously updated, globally distributed software system. And that question is this software currently permitted to behave the way it is behaving? That's not a question about who is using it. It's not a question about whether the code is authentic. It's not a question about whether the system is secure. It's a question about whether the behavior occurring right now is within the scope of what has been authorized. And that question belongs to licensing. And for most of the software's industry history, licensing has not functioned as part of the trust infrastructure at all, not even within the ownership layer where it most logically belongs.
Section 2. Why licensing was left out.
The exclusion of licensing from the trust stack wasn't an oversight. It was a logical consequence of how the software industry developed. Licensing, for most of its existence, lived in a completely different domain. It was a commercial function. Contracts, invoices, audit rights, renewal cycles. The legal department handled it, the sales team negotiated, and finance tracked it, and the engineering and security teams had almost no contact with it at all. This made sense, again, when software was static. When the commercial terms and the operational reality were established simultaneously and neither changed, there was no reason for licensing to interact with the runtime. It was a point-in-time agreement about a point-in-time product. Once the sale was made, licensing receded into the background. But that separation created a structural assumption that persisted long after it stopped being valid. The assumption that commercial terms and operational behavior are two different things managed separately by different people with different tools on different timescales. And what that assumption produces in a world of continuously updated, dynamically configured, globally distributed software is a gap. The gap between what a system is commercially authorized to do and what it is technically capable of doing, or what it is actually doing right now. I want to give this gap a name because naming it makes it easier to reason about. Call it entitlement decay. Entitlement decay is what happens when the distance between a software system's commercial terms and its actual runtime behavior quietly widens over time. It doesn't trigger alerts, it doesn't appear in security dashboards, it doesn't surface in incident reports, it accumulates silently through updates that add capabilities beyond what was originally licensed, through configuration changes that activate features beyond the contracted tier, through the normal evolution of both the software and the organization using it. And here is what makes entitlement decay particularly consequential. It is asymmetric in how it is discovered. For the vendor, discovery typically comes through audit, through complaint, or through revenue loss, long after the drift has accumulated. For the customer, discovery may come through a compliance review, or in regulated industries through examination by a third party with considerably more authority than either the vendor or customer anticipated. In both cases, the moment of discovery is also the moment of maximum exposure. The question is no longer whether the entitlement gap exists, it is how long it has existed, what actions occurred within it, and what the consequences of those actions are under the applicable regulatory framework. Think about what that means in an industrial context. A system authorized for one operational configuration, one software version, one feature set, one regional compliance posture, continues operating under a different configuration after an update. Not through anyone's deliberate choice, through the normal friction of deployment cycles, update schedules, and the reality that nobody has a completely live view of what every deployed instance of a product is actually doing. In that context, the entitlement gap isn't just a commercial problem. A system operating outside its licensed configuration may also be operating outside its validated configuration, And in sectors where regulatory approval, safety case integrity, and certification are bound to specific software sales, that's not a licensing problem. It is an operational and compliance problem of a categorically different order. The three layers of the conventional model cannot close this gap. Identity cannot close it because the gap isn't about who is using the system. Cryptography cannot close it because the gap isn't about whether the code is authentic. And security cannot close it because the gap isn't about whether the system is being attacked. The gap exists in the space between technical capability and commercial authorization, and the only layer that can close it is the one that governs that boundary.
Section 3. Licensing as an operational layer.
So what does it look like when licensing moves from a commercial function into an operational one? The shift is deceptively simple to describe, but significant in its implications. Traditional licensing answers a binary question. Can this user use this application? Yes or no? The answer was checked at installation, maybe at periodic intervals, and otherwise assumed to remain valid until something changed it at the commercial level, a renewal, a lease, an audit. Runtime licensing answers something far more dynamic. What is this software permitted to do right now? Not at installation, not at the last audit, but right now in this operational context under the current commercial terms, in this geography, at this service tier, with this usage volume. The shift is subtle, but it changes almost everything downstream. Entitlement becomes a live condition embedded in the runtime itself. Not a record held in a contract or a spreadsheet or a licensing server that gets queried occasionally. The software knows its permitted state. It enforces that state constantly. It updates when commercial terms change. It reflects regional constraints, subscription tier, usage volume, and time-bound activations without requiring human intervention at each transition point. Let me give you a concrete example of why this matters. Take a manufacturer delivering a platform to customers across multiple regions. That platform has a modular capabilities, a core set in the base license, and additional modules that can be activated based on what each customer has contracted. Some modules are region restricted, some are time bound, activated for a trial period and then requiring a commercial decision. Some are safety critical. They could only be activated in installations that have completed a specific certification process. In a static licensing model, managing that complexity requires manual processes. Someone has to track what each customer has contracted. Someone has to ensure that updates don't inadvertently activate capabilities beyond the contracted scope. Someone has to verify that region-restricted modules aren't running in the wrong jurisdiction. And someone has to do all of this across a deployed base that might number in the thousands of installations, updating continuously in locations the vendor can't physically access. In a runtime licensing model, the software enforces its own permitted state. The entitlement layer is embedded. When a feature is activated beyond the contracted scope, the system knows and enforces the boundary. When a time-bound activation expires, the capability deactivates. When a region-restricted module is queried from an unauthorized jurisdiction, that request is denied, not through manual oversight, through the operational layer of the software itself. In other words, the commercial model becomes executable infrastructure. And that phrase, executable infrastructure, is the one I want to hold on to, because it's where licensing stops being a commercial afterthought and becomes something structurally different. The business model is no longer defined only by what's written in a contract. It's defined by what the software will and won't do. The terms of the agreement are encoded into the operational behavior of the system. This also changes the relationship between licensing and protection. Because if entitlement is enforced at the runtime layer, the integrity of that enforcement depends on the integrity of the code itself. An entitlement layer that can be bypassed or modified isn't really an entitlement layer, it's a suggestion, which is why modern licensing architectures increasingly treat protection and entitlement as a unified problem rather than separate concerns. The software is both authentic, protected against tampering, and correctly entitled, which means it's operating within its authorized scope. Those two properties reinforce each other. You need cryptographic integrity to trust that the entitlement layer hasn't been modified. You need the entitlement layer to ensure that the protected code is operating within the boundaries it was authorized to operate within. Protection and monetization converged, not because it's convenient, but because the architecture demands it.
Section 4, the regulatory dimension.
Now, I want to bring this back to where we ended last week, because the argument Anna and I were making about Europe's regulatory landscape, that these frameworks aren't separate policies but a coherent operational system, has a very specific implication for licensing that I don't think gets discussed far enough. The Cyber Resilience Act, which is the regulation most directly relevant here, does something that previous cybersecurity frameworks didn't. It makes cybersecurity obligations enforceable after deployment, not just at the point of sale, not just at the moment of installation, throughout the operational life cycle of the product, through updates, through configuration changes, through remediation, through end of life. Now that is a fundamental shift. Traditional security mechanisms protected software at build time. The CRA requires the protection to persist in the field, and the mechanism that remains active in the field that can enforce compliance posture continuously across a deployed base without physical intervention is licensing. Think about what the CRA actually requires across the product lifecycle. At development at design, it requires security-critical features to be activated only in authorized contexts. That's licensing logic. Controlled enablement of functionality, modular activation based on verified entitlement. At release and distribution, it requires accountability for product versions. Only approved and compliant versions should be activatable. That's licensing logic. Version-bound activation, controlled rollout, traceable distribution. At deployment and activation, it requires protection against unauthorized access. That's licensing logic. Trusted identities for software and devices across granted only after successful verification. During operation and updates, it requires that security fixes reach only validated installations. That's licensing logic, controlled update delivery, enforced configuration management. And at remediation and end of life, it requires the ability to withdraw, replace, or restrict product usage when vulnerabilities arise or compliance is compromised. That's licensing logic. Enforced remediation, license withdrawal, managed end of life without physical recall. At every stage of the product lifecycle, the mechanism that enabled the CRA's requirements to be met in the field, not just documented but actually enforced, is the licensing layer. which means licensing isn't just completing the trust stack from a technical perspective, it's completing it from a regulatory perspective. Under the CRA, licensing becomes a governance mechanism, not only about monetization, about demonstrable compliance. And this brings me to the argument I want to land today. If the trust stack is a framework for asking whether a system can be relied upon, and it is, then the complete answer requires 4 layers, not 3. Identity establishes who is acting. Cryptography establishes what is present is authentic. Security establishes that the environment is trustworthy. And licensing establishes that the behavior occurring within that environment is permitted, commercially, operationally, and increasingly legally. At the quantum space, we describe the trust architecture in 5 layers: ownership, responsibility, control, participation, and time. Each layer answers a distinct question about how digital systems earn and maintain the right to be relied upon. Ownership, the foundation, asks who controls the infrastructure, the software, and the data that underpins digital systems. And what the licensing argument reveals is that ownership has never been fully operationalized. We've had the hardware, we've had the platforms, we've had the data, but the mechanism that enforces what the software is actually permitted to do, that governs the boundary between commercial authorization and operational behavior, has been absent from the runtime entirely. Licensing, properly implemented, is that mechanism. It's not a new layer, it is the missing enforcement arm of the layer that was always there.
Section 5. What this means in practice.
I want to spend a few minutes on the practical implications of this because the argument can sound abstract until you think through what it actually changes. The first implication is for software vendors. If licensing is infrastructure, not a commercial afterthought, but an actual operational layer, then the decision about how to build or adopt a licensing system is an architectural decision, not a procurement decision. It has the same weight as decisions about security architecture or identity infrastructure. It affects what you can offer commercially, how you manage compliance, and what your operational costs look like at scale. There's a tendency to treat licensing as something you figure out after the product is built, a system where you bolt on when the revenue numbers get large enough to justify it, or when a customer audit forces the issue. That approach creates the conditions for entitlement decay, and it creates an architectural constraint that becomes progressively harder to resolve as the deployed base grows. The alternative, and this is what the market is moving towards, is to treat licensing as part of the foundational architecture. Not necessarily the most complex implementation from day one, but architecturally coherent from day one. A system that can evolve as the commercial model evolves without requiring the kind of infrastructure rebuild that forces a choice between short-term disruption and long-term drift. Licensing as a service is the mechanism that makes this practically accessible. The entry threshold has dropped. You don't have to choose between under-engineering now or over-engineering up front. You can start with established frameworks: perpetual, subscription, floating, usage-based, and refine them as your commercial strategy matures on a back-end architecture that scales with you rather than constraining you. The second implication is for operators and buyers. If licensing is a compliance mechanism, it's the layer that enforces CRA obligations in the field. Then evaluating a vendor's licensing architecture is part of evaluating their compliance posture. Not a separate question, the same question. Can this vendor demonstrate that only validated software versions are active in the field? Can they enforce an update to a compliant version across the deployed base without manual intervention? Can they withdraw a compromised capability without a physical recall? Can they show an auditor a traceable record of what entitlement stage each installation was in at a given moment in time? If the answer to any of those questions is no, the licensing architecture is a compliance liability, and under the CRA, that is not a minor administrative concern. The third implication is more structural, and it's the one that connects back to the conversation Anna and I had last week. If European regulation is best understood as a coherent operational system rather than a collection of separate policies, and I think the evidence for that reading is strong, then licensing is one of the places where the logic of that system becomes most concrete. The business wallet gives organizations machine verifiable authority. The CRA requires that compliance obligations persist in the field. NIS 2 extends accountability across supply chains. And the mechanism that connects those requirements to the operational layer of the software, the thing that actually enforces them at runtime, is the licensing infrastructure. Which means that companies building licensing infrastructure aren't peripheral to this regulatory shift. They are structural to it. And that's a significant repositioning for an industry that has spent most of its history being described as a cost center or a piracy prevention tool. I want to close with something that I find genuinely useful when I'm thinking about how technologies mature. The layers of the trust stack didn't arrive simultaneously. Identity infrastructure took decades to develop into something that worked at scale. Cryptographic standards evolved through failures and attacks and hard-won mathematical progress. Security practices consolidated around real incidents with real consequences. Nobody decided theoretically that these things mattered. The world demonstrated that they mattered through failures and their consequences, and the industry responded. Licensing as an operational infrastructure is on the same trajectory. The consequences of unmanaged entitlement are accumulating in revenue leakage, in compliance exposure, in the widening gap between commercial intent and operational reality. The regulatory frameworks coming into force are making those consequences legally enforceable rather than merely commercially undesirable. And the market is responding, not because runtime licensing is theoretically elegant, but because the alternative has become demonstrably insufficient. The trust stack has always been a framework for asking whether a system can be relied upon. At the quantum space, we've mapped that architecture across 5 layers: ownership, responsibility, control, participation, and time. Each layer is necessary, none is sufficient on its own, and the ownership layer, the foundation, has never been complete because the mechanism that enforces what software is actually authorized to do has been missing from the runtime. A system can be authenticated, cryptographically sound, and securely hardened, and still be operating outside the scope of what it was commercially and legally permitted to do. In a world where software is the operational layer of industrial systems, financial infrastructures, and critical services, that gap is not acceptable. Licensing is not a peripheral concern within this architecture. It is the enforcement mechanism that makes ownership real, the piece that's been present in principle and absent in practice. And it is arriving now, not as an administrative update, but as infrastructure. For next week on this podcast, Innovating Trust, I'll be joined by Stefan Bamberg of Vibu Systems. Stefan is Director of Sales and Key Account Management at Vibu Systems, and he's been at the center of how this market is evolving for more than a decade. We're going to get into the specifics, how runtime licensing actually works in industrial environments, what the business model transition looks like from the vendor side, and what the CRA means for companies who haven't yet thought about licensing as a compliance mechanism, or where the real friction points are in making the shift. If today's episode raised questions about how the theory translates into operational reality, that's the conversation we'll be having next week. And I assure you, it will be worth your time. There are also 3 pieces on the quantum space this week that go deeper into the arguments I've covered today. On licensing as infrastructure, on entitlement decay as a structural risk, and on what runtime licensing means for the ownership layer of the trust stack. You'll find them at thequantumspace.org. If you want the written version of this argument with the detail that audio doesn't allow, that's where to go. So you've been listening to Innovating Trust from the Quantum Space, where we examine the technologies, frameworks, and infrastructure that makes digital trust possible. Until next Thursday, thank you and goodbye. This was Innovating Trust, a Quantum Space podcast edited and produced by Crown Communications.